Kate Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot and very possibly the podcast Psychics and Psychos, a metaphysical true crime analysis. This is video 2. You don't want to miss the first video. If you haven't seen it, go back and watch that first, in which I am presenting a sort of overview of terminology and theory about psychiatric disorders, personality disorders, criminal behavior from a psychological point of view. And I will reiterate that the experts don't agree. There's debate. A lot of these things overlap. They're uncertain sometimes with what's going on. And I am not a professional. Denise is not a professional. We're just dipping into this information and trying to apply it in our amateur way. So this is video 2, psychology and criminality. So number 1 here is psychosis and crime. Psychosis is not considered insanity in the eyes of the law. Legally, insanity is somebody with insanity is somebody who is not criminally responsible for his actions. And from the Psychology Today of May 31st, 2022, I have some information here. A person who is psychotic, this would be a schizophrenic, is 11 times more likely to be victimized and 11 times more likely to be the victim of especially the judicial system. We are inadequate in our response to mental illness in our judicial system. It's hardly justice. It's pretty terrible. 90% of psychotics are not violent at all. If they hurt anybody, they hurt themselves. They're far more likely to be the victims of crime. There's a serious false perception of their threat. Most violence in psychotics is related to substance misuse, which is only about 10% of all psychotics ever evince any sort of violent behavior. However, people with psychotic disorders are 33 times more likely to kill themselves than anybody else. 30% of suicides are under care for mental health problems. Often they're demonized in the media. It's really terrible, the misunderstanding, the stereotypes and mischaracterizations that have gone on. They have really created damage. They're considered other, alien, scary, and they're demonized, and we create the separation from ourselves. We aren't that. We don't need to worry about that because we aren't that. Well, it can be anybody. If you have the right unfortunate combination of trauma or illness or injury in your life, you never know. 3 out of 1,000 people with psychotic issues will kill somebody else. This is pretty much the same rate of behavior, of criminality, homicidal violence on the part of people who are not diagnosed psychotic, but who are abusing substances. So that's psychosis and crime. Putting it into perspective, 90% never commit a crime against another person. Sociopaths and crime, that's a whole different story. They're usually not psychotic. They're usually not delusional. You can be both, but usually they're not. They simply have, because it's an antisocial personality disorder, as we talked about in the last video, they have no regard for the law, no regard for others, and they're impulsive. They're quick to anger. They're quick to aggression. They're quick to take offense. And they're callous and self-serving. They don't care who they hurt to get what they want. Their relationships are in chaos at home and at work. They're always getting into fights, those sorts of people. About 35% of the prison population is got an antisocial personality disorder, and they commit up to 90% of the crimes. So they're dangerous. Now, psychopaths and crime. Psychopaths, you know, Hannibal Lecter. Everybody thinks immediately of that. Ted Bundy. So that's a misunderstanding of psychopaths. According to the Department of Justice, about 1 in 100 people, 1 out of 100 is a psychopath. So that's about 1% of the population. And if they're intelligent, they commit about 90% of all crime. But this includes white-collar crime. It's important to remember that. It's more likely, rather than committing antisocial criminal activity outside the home, it's more likely that they will be domestic abusers and controllers. According to Dr. Hare from the University of British Columbia, psychopathology is about 1% of the population. I can't read my handwriting. 25 to 35% of the prison population, with 35% of the prison population. And they commit twice as many crimes as other people. Half the serial rapists are psychopathic. They're usually not mentally ill. About 1 in 5 might be delusional. They're not usually, they don't usually know right from wrong. They may understand what society says is right versus wrong, but means nothing to them. And we're talking about the 1% that, you know, the tiny number that commit terrible crimes. They have an overwhelming compulsion. Nobody knows why. The recidivism is twice the number in the general population, and they're 3 times as likely to recommit violence. In general, now this is debated, so we're just talking about the debate. There are a variety of personality disorders or psychopathology, psychopathy that are involved in criminal behavior. Not all psychopaths are serial killers. You need to remember that. And as I mentioned last time, the top careers: lawyer, CEO, politician, cop, surgeon, and specifically neurosurgeon, and clergy, religious leaders. And if you think about these jobs, you need a cool head, you need a steady hand, you need to be willing to plow ahead and do what you need to do without consideration for how it affects other people. Clergy, you have to be willing to manipulate. And for surgeons, this really doesn't surprise me. I've worked with surgeons, and I would say not all surgeons are psychopaths. Everybody calm down. But if you think about, if you're a neurosurgeon, you have your hands in somebody else's brain, and the slightest misstep, you can destroy a life. You need a very steady hand. You need to not get nervous. And it takes a rare kind of person. Now, some people can do this and not be psychopathic. They could be wonderful people. In fact, there's a great documentary series about some neurosurgeons in New York City. I would recommend it. I wish I could remember the name of it, but it should be simple to find. But there are plenty of really difficult characters who are neurosurgeons. And it's because despite all this negativity about their personality disorder, they can do these delicate surgeries and not think anything of it at all. And that makes them actually a safer surgeon in some cases because they're steady. Very interesting. Okay. What do we got here? Oh, the dark triad. So I did a little extra research here. In 2002, there was a theory put out by Delroy, Paul House, and Kevin Williams. And the dark triad, 3 non-offensive, non-pathological personality types that are associated with a callous, manipulative personality style when they overlap. So you can have any one of these personality types. You put all 3 together, this can become a toxic mix. And it's called dark because often it's hidden, and because each has sort of malevolent qualities. So the first is narcissism. There's this overriding ego and lack of empathy. The second is Machiavellianism. And as I showed you last time, Machiavelli wrote the book The Prince. This is sort of the guidebook to narcissism. It's really interesting. Machiavellianism is a set of characteristics that include manipulation and exploitation of people and situations, no sense of ethics or morality, unemotional, callous, and a high level of self-interest. The Prince. The third of the dark triad is psychopathy, and this is an antisocial personality disorder that includes many of these other features, but it also includes a very important feature of a complete lack of remorse. When you put all of these together, it's just, as I said, a toxic mix. A high score for having these traits indicates a high likelihood of committing crimes and social distress and creating problems for organizations, especially if they're the leader of the organization. Human resources, hiring people should be aware of this stuff. They have no compassion or low compassion, empathy, belief that others are good, or agreeability, very low. The strongest correlation between these 3 personality types is in their lack of agreeability. So they're people that just don't get along. They want what they want when they want it, and they don't care about anybody else. They are the nightmare boss, is what they are. Then there's the theory of the McDonald triad. And this has gone in and out of favor, but I thought it would be a good thing to mention it. This is called the triad of sociopathy, or the homicidal triad. 2 or more of these characteristics is predictive of violent offenses. So this includes enuresis over the age of 5, wetting the bed over the age of 5. And actually now they understand that, especially in boys, that can go on to close to 10 years old without being pathological. It's got to do with neurological development. But the whole entire theory has kind of fallen out of favor, and yeah, it's still an interesting thing to think about. The other feature of it is animal cruelty as a child, and then fire setting, arson, playing with fire. It was first proposed in 1963 in the American Journal of Psychiatry by J.M. McDonald. And John Douglas, Robert Ressler, who wrote this book, and Anne Burgess believed there was substantial evidence to associate that if these 3 things, this triad, appeared in childhood, it was predictive of predatory behavior, especially sexual homicide. And today, like I said, this has now become out of favor and is controversial. Some say these symptoms are indicative of childhood abuse, is what they're really indicative of, which can in itself lead to violence, but there may be attributing it to a certain kind of serial killer indication. It's really about trauma in childhood, especially sexual abuse. A child that has a dysfunctional home and maybe has been abused may show these signs, and it's not necessarily predictive. Some truth and somewhat overblown emphasis has been put on this, like I said, controversial. These signs would be considered signs of sociopathy potential in children. They're often associated with conduct disorders, and conduct disorders are actually more predictive of violence. They're children that don't have boundaries, who don't regard the rights of other people, who don't know the difference between right and wrong, and have no remorse or sympathy as children, which is a really disturbing thing to see in children. They might show pathological lying, manipulating, harming others, especially for personal gain. They will break the law repeatedly without remorse, like as teenagers. They have no regard for the safety rules or personal responsibility for their behavior. Strong indications of narcissism. They're quick to overreact. They're sensitive to criticism. They're quick to anger. And they have superficial charm that goes away if they don't get their own way. So those are real red flags in childhood. Now let's talk about serial killers. They're a special little group. So a serial killer is defined as a person who kills 2, 3, 4, or more, and it's argued, which is why I listed all the numbers, of people over more than a month with significant time between the killings known as the cooling off period. The FBI says that motives are for psychological gratification, often sexual gratification. And there are categories for the motives of serial killers. So serial killers are broken down into types. So the first, and Denise and I had a debate about this, which just goes to show you, if you're not trained, it's easy to see connections that maybe are not completely accurate, and even the experts who are trained don't always necessarily agree, and somebody can be more than one kind. So it's very complicated. So the first kind of serial killer is the visionary serial killer, somebody who is often extremely disorganized. This is a person who feels that there's somebody or some entity commanding him to kill. They're probably psychotic, and they don't necessarily have a specific target. They will randomly kill people. And an example of that is the Vampire of Sacramento, Richard Chase, and very possibly David Berkowitz, but he's debated. It's very interesting. The second kind of serial killer is mission-oriented. And this is the one that Denise and I disagreed on. And what I've read is that the Green River Killer was mission-oriented. They're organized. They're on a quest to rid society of a specific group. And he was on a quest to rid society of sex workers. They're not psychotic. They're meticulous, obsessive, and organized. Did I say that? I might have already said that. The third kind is the hedonistic serial killer. Now, these are also known as lust killers. They do it for thrill, or they do it for comfort. I thought that was so interesting. You could be doing it for lust, doing it for the thrill, or you can doing it for a specific benefit. And an example of that would be the landlady who poisons people. And it's often women who fall into this subcategory of hedonistic serial killers. So examples of a hedonistic serial killer, according to my resources, and once again debatable, Ted Bundy, BTK, Dorothy Puente, the landlady from, I believe, Sacramento, who killed all the old guys and collected their Social Security. It's done for pleasure. It could be done for rape or torture because they're sadistic, or for money, for profit. The fourth kind is the power and control serial killer, and this is somebody who's very organized. And remember, we said that they can overlap. So an example would be Bundy and BTK. So they could be both things. They could be lust killers and power and control killers. They're fantasy driven. They've got some weird scenario going on in their head. But they seek domination and control. And there's lots of overlap. Can't emphasize that enough. You can have other issues going on too, and as an example was Berkowitz. They are not sure what to make of him. He may have been psychotic. He may have been involved in something weird other than what he did, as well as what he did. Then Ed Gein, the guy that, you know, treated people like animals that he hunted and hung up and cut up, and it was really gross. And according to Dr. Michael Stone from Columbia University, about 1 out of 5 serial killers are delusional or psychotic. So there's a lot going on there. So people who kill in general, there's different types. There's people who kill more than one person. There's the serial killer. And they're defined by the number of people they kill and then that cooling off period. They kind of have to rework the fantasy and build up to it. The second kind of person who kills more than 1 or 2 people is the spree killer. And there's a very short time between who they kill, no cooling off period. And then the third is the mass killer that do a large number of people in one attack. So I looked up mass killers because that's, you know, on everybody's mind, and we wonder what the heck is going on there. They're not entirely certain all the time. Some of them are driven by, well, let me get into this. Dr. Michael Stone, again, from Columbia University, says that only 1 out of 5 mass killers is psychotic. And so when they talk about we don't need gun control, we need better mental health care. We need better mental health care, but that's not going to address mass killers. Why not? Only 22% of them have any kind of definable mental disorder. 65% or more have antisocial personality disorder. They're either delusional from depression, have ADHD, learning disabilities, long-term stress, and 40% have substance abuse, but they have no mental illness. They begin obsessing about a thought. Now, this is really important because the media feed into this, social media and stuff. They become obsessed about a thought. Some of it is racial animus, some of it is misogyny, like incels, some of it's a political thing, and they obsess, and it grows and obsess and grows. They have a high sense of injustice or humiliation for whatever their little pet peeve is, and they're defined by the doctor as injustice collectors. The FBI says they're high on the paranoid spectrum. The Department of Justice gets all the same results and statistics as Columbia University and the FBI. Only about 20% are psychotic. So this is the end of my overview of psychological terms, so that when we talk about psychopathy, mental disorders, etc., 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 everybody knows the resources we've used and the basic understanding that we have. And I think the things that are important to remember are, we're not experts, we're just postulating. We're postulating based on a lot of research. The research doesn't agree with itself. There's a lot of debate in professional circles. It's an unfolding understanding, which is what science is like. The more they learn, they change their position as they get more information, more data, and a better understanding. And they've gotten a lot of help from the ability to do MRIs and those sorts of studies, because now they can watch the brain as it functions. And it's helped a lot, which I believe is a lot about this book. The other thing to remember is that most psychopaths never commit a violent crime against other individuals. But serial killers are usually antisocial personalities with psychopathy, sociopathy, whatever. They all have different reasons for being serial killers. They're a strange bunch and they're a small bunch, but they loom large in entertainment, unfortunately. It's an unbelievable number of true crime podcasts and TV shows and movies and books. People have a fascination with this, and I don't think it's a dark fascination coming from some aberrant interest. I think we all are trying very hard to understand. And I hope this helped. I hope this brings some clarity to the topic. And we'll talk again. Thank you very much for listening. And Slanka Foil. Slancha.